Welcome everybody, and welcome to our online audience as well. I'm delighted this afternoon to have with me Oliver Morley, who has relatively recently taken over as Chief Executive of the PPF, who we all know and love. Been an interesting 6 months, 6 to 8 months, is it, for Oliver, given all that's been happening in the news, and also as a relative newcomer to pensions. So really interested to hear your perspective, Oliver, about those first 6 months, where you see the PPF going in future, and also a little bit about your perspective coming from outside the industry as well. So, excellent, thank you.
Thank you. I have to move across to the podium too, otherwise I will pace around. Thank you, Joe, for the kind introduction, and a real pleasure to be here for my first appearance at the PLSA. Every pensions event I've been to so far has had a ceremonial exchange of how long you've been in the pensions industry, generally decades. In that spirit, as Joe said, it is for me, in fact, 7 months tomorrow, that since I took up the post of Chief Executive at PPF. It's been intense, and it has been really challenging, but also it's been really, really interesting. And with a select committee almost straight out of the blocks, I was put on my toes really quite quickly, but I am glad to be here, for the most part, unscathed. Now, obviously, I'm going to presume you all know about the PPF, so I'm not going to go into a review of the PPF. But you probably don't know that much about me, given my background is non-pensions. I come very much from a focus on customer service and technology and digitization. So I came from DVLA, which is where I ran the organization before, and also Thomson Reuters and the National Archives. So I have some experience in selling to financial services and funds generally, but not of being in them. Given that background, as you would expect, I spent a lot of time listening to the industry, trying to understand some of the challenges, trying to understand some of the needs of members, and where I can use my previous experience to kind of build on the evolution that PPF has gone through over the past over 10 years now. But before I talk about vision and next steps, I thought I'd kick off with some reflections of what I've found so far. It almost goes without saying nowadays that we remain the essential safety net. Already this year, we've seen Carillion, the old British Steel pension scheme, and most recently House of Fraser enter PPF assessment. The fact that we're able to provide a high level of protection for members in the event of insolvency, and by definition, PPF members get more from us than they would have done from their own underfunded scheme, makes me enormously proud and continues to prove why the PPF is so important in protecting DB pension scheme members. And of course, we recognise that this is also in part due to the important contributions that you, or the schemes you advise, make in the form of levy. We wouldn't be able to provide the protection we do without you and the levy that you contribute, and especially in the early stages of the PPF. Because that's only one of our sources of funding now, and I'm pleased to say that our funding position has continued to strengthen. So despite last year taking on pension schemes with deficits totaling about £1.2 billion, we've seen a continued growth in our reserves to 6.7 billion and an increase in our funding ratio to 122.8%. Although I'm not complacent in any way, and certainly not at all confident we can expect this to continue year on year, especially given wider financial volatility. But notwithstanding that, we reported strong investment performance ahead of target with a 2.8% investment contribution. And it's thanks to a strong funding position that we were able to announce that we will cut the amount of total levy, it may be different for individual schemes, but total levy by around 10%. So I am continued successful and indeed transparent investment strategy for the PPF. We've just opened a new office in the city, this houses our largely insourced investment team. And we continue to remain firmly on course to meet our funding target. Ideally, and what we're targeting is 2030. This patient and prudent approach has really impressed me and is a standard I believe we can share more widely, and I'd like to see our investment strategy generally available in more detail for people. You may have read this summer that we're starting to think about life in the long term, and certainly that's one of the reasons I was asked to join PPF, particularly if we're in a positive position of having substantial reserves. But there is a long way to go. 2030 is a reasonable amount of time, and indeed really reflects a target. It's a goal for us. But a lot could happen in the intervening time. We need to manage our balance sheet in such a way that we are reaching sustainability over the next 10 years. And there are still individual schemes, as you know, whose deficit is greater than our current reserves. If one of those were to come to the PPF with a large deficit, that reserve could be entirely wiped out. So moving on to customer service, I've been very focused on driving higher standards of customer service to our members, although I have to say we start from a high base. I was delighted to see, after I'd arrived, our member services team receive the Institute of Customer Services Service Mark accreditation. And I am committed to improving customer service for levy payers as well. I know you have to pay it, but I have some experience of, what's the right way to put it, making sure that those kind of payments are as easy and painless as possible, even if you do have to pay it. But we've made a lot of progress, and there's significant further progress that PPF can make in the future. We have to continue to evolve. We have to look to the future. And I certainly want to see PPF in a position where we can continue to give the guarantee for schemes that we have done in the past for many, many years to come. And with that in mind, we're in the process of defining a new strategic plan. PPF has tended to have an annual strategic plan, and what I've asked our board to support is a transition to a 3-year strategic plan. So we'll be able to set out to you, especially important given the kind of general challenges just in terms of economic and financial uncertainty. We want to be able to give more assurance, more clarity as to the kind of thing that we are trying to do. So by 2022, I'd see the PPF as being agile, innovative, able to respond to opportunities as they present themselves in government and beyond, delivering really some of the highest standards of service and technology for our levy payers and our members, with benchmark setting quality of service. I do, and the PPF, the members of the staff of the PPF, are fundamentally of the view that when someone comes to the PPF, although they may have gone through quite a traumatic experience in some cases, we want them to be able to experience a very high level of customer service when they arrive with us, but equally do that efficiently and at the right kind of cost. We want to deliver a really high standard of transparency, so you can see why we make decisions, you can see where the money goes, and you can have confidence in our ability to invest. And we want to engage more directly and effectively with our levy payers. What does that mean? Well, we want to improve the levy consultation approach. It's quite extensive and quite complicated, and generally in some cases will require advisors to support it. We want to make it more accessible and understandable for all our levy payers, and that includes SMEs. We recognise that smaller schemes may not quite have the ability to go through the huge nitty-gritty of the way we present our proposals, but we also want them to be able to engage, and we want to improve that process. We're asking in our proposals for the levy year 2019-20 what your feedback would be on how we can improve your options for payment, and I remain extremely keen to hear your views. We are also, in this consultation, asking people what they think, how we should apply the levy to consolidators. And again, we're very interested in your engagement on that and hearing your views. We have made a proposal, and our approach is very definitely to seek a levy which is risk reflective, flexible, so we can adjust it to reflect real risk and different scenarios. And we are basing it on the existing schemes without a significant sponsor, substantial sponsor rules, but with some adjustments to consider that very special risk. I was interviewed earlier. We are very much in favour, as the Minister is, in consolidators. PPF represents itself a good example of a consolidator that is doing well in the right regulatory structure, and we ourselves would like to see consolidators in that position, but we are very, very clear that the kind of missing piece we can apply a levy is that there is a very clear regulatory structure that supports consolidators and makes sure they can be successful, and so can members. I'll talk very briefly, finally, about technology. I have some experience of making some significant technological change in a business that may not necessarily have embraced it in the past. Actually, the PPF has done some really interesting things already. So we have our Retire Online service, which is starting to be transformative, and actually a lot of our members are finding it incredibly useful. But we also have to make some changes to things which are maybe haven't moved on quite as much. So our website will be relaunching in November. Our last update was back in 2008, and we didn't have iPhones at that stage. So it's a kind of much needed improvement, and I look forward to seeing that available on mobile as well. We've actually also, we're also launching on Facebook as well, and we will, you may not have noticed, but the PPF Twitter account is effectively nothing happens on it. So we are going to be launching social media more generally, and that's not just so we can communicate, it's also so we can engage with members, particularly on Facebook, and give them new channels to get access to the PPF that they simply wouldn't have had in the past. It'll provide also an improved interface for those who need to file S120 notices and for showing trustee documents. Although I have to admit, I do a thing round the business at PPF, and I was opening mail the other day, and I still see those paper S120s coming in. So it's clear that we still will provide what I would say is the cornerstone of everything at the moment, which is a good multi-channel business. One final thing, which I know people were really interested in, was our approach to the European Court of Justice ruling on the threshold in terms of the value of the accrued pension in the event of employer insolvency. We are working deliberately fast on this. We know members want certainty. We know members want to understand their position. And we are certainly moving quickly to start having those discussions with members, understanding if they feel that they have a claim, and making sure that we are in a position to give as many clear answers, given there are still legal questions that are outstanding, as we possibly can. If you've been concerned separately as a trustee or advisor that this judgment will lead to an increase in your levy payment, our current best estimate is that the levy will increase by up to 1% at the very most in terms of the total levy as a result of these changes. So we are confident in the PPF's overall ability to meet that increase. So I've touched on a lot of things in 15 minutes, and I did want to get a fair amount of information across, being as this is one of my first speeches as the Chief Executive of PPF. I do want to say what a privilege it is to be in this industry, and it is remarkable to me how much the PPF provides an incredibly important backstop, but it is a backstop to the work that schemes, good trustees, and good advisors do. And we are very conscious that there's a limit on the resources available to the PPF, and the things that really protect us are obviously a good regulator, but at the same time, good trustees, good schemes, and employers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm just going to call a slight bit of technical assistance. Well, while I do that, I'll ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll open to the floor.
Is that me?
It's the steps, maybe. So just seem to have lost the online questions. Busy 7 months.
Yep.
Lots of things, lots of different things happening. I mean, just picking up a couple of them. I think.
I think it's often slightly underappreciated the size that the PPF has gotten to as a scheme. Probably now amongst the top 5 schemes in terms of assets under management in the UK. Quite possibly also in terms of membership certainly with the insourcing of the financial assistance scheme as well.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in, given your new size or growing size, where you think on that kind of technological frontier, whether PPF should be kind of bleeding edge or leading edge, and what can it do to kind of help move the industry along, given this is an area that we possibly can act in?
Do you want me to summarise it? And then we'll sort it out. So given, I can give the numbers as well. So given the PPF scale of about 30 billion in assets under management, and probably by next year about 36, 37 billion, as we take in BHS and Carillion. Given that scale, and given our around 400,000 members when you add in FAS, where should we be in terms of technology? Should we be on the bleeding edge or somewhere in the middle? The first thing for me when making choices around technology is that it should be customer/member-led. There is no point in bringing something in that, frankly, no one is going to use. And so I'm not necessarily sure. I will let the fintech industry experiment with, some of the more eclectic approaches in terms of financial services. But equally, I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is by saying, well, they're pensioners, they're not going to use online, and they'd be, they're not interested. The reality is that we can work on providing a really good set of services that make it incredibly easy for people to use us. That will exploit, in my view, we will be needing to think about what we do in terms of an app. We will be needing to think about how we would work more widely with the industry in terms of pensions dashboard. We will be looking at web chat, which certainly our indications are that members would really find that useful. And we also, interestingly, need to make sure that we're providing our own staff, our contact centre staff, access to the same tools that we're now providing members, because in some cases they only have access to legacy internal systems. We're exposing amazing services to the customer, and they can't get hold of them.
I slightly remember some of those services from my time at the PPF. We've got a few questions on the app. I'll just open to the floor if anybody's got a kind of burning question you want to ask just now, or whilst you're thinking of one. We'll go to 3 slightly connected questions, actually.
Okay.
So one is, given your economies of scale now, might you ever consider offering admin type services to smaller size schemes? And then connected, I think, might also be predecessors in your post have not ruled out the possibility of some form of privatisation of the PPF or elements of it. Is that something that's could be on the cards in the future?
I think that wider question, I think, is an interesting one. Let me put it this way. I think one of the most important things about the PPF is that it is a really interesting combination of public sector organisation and financial services organisation. And one of the things that becomes really clear very quickly is right the way through the business, and even, you might not believe this, but even in the investment team, there is an understanding, a really deep understanding of the value that the PPF provides to wider society. And I think it would be a shame to lose that. I would never rule it out, because I never rule anything out when you are connected to government. It's always wise not to. But for me, there's a personal attraction, and our staff generally find there is an attraction to the fact that PPF is doing, quotes, a good thing. And I genuinely believe it. Having said that, when it comes to something like admin and more generally, I'm always looking for new opportunities for the PPF. And I believe that, in my previous job, I always used to enjoy telling people generally that we were around 25 to 50% more efficient than our nearest private sector competitor. And people didn't believe me, but we could actually give them the audited figures. And that is something that, in some ways, is quite difficult for people to understand. But I do believe an organisation like PPF can be incredibly efficient. And I do believe in some ways we can provide ways for other people to get access to that efficiency.
Very interesting. I'd be interested in hearing, having come from a new perspective, what was it that element of member engagement that attracted you to the PPF in the first place?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was also interested in moving in some ways back to, Thomson Reuters is about, where I was working was about as near to being in financial services as you could be. So I was interested in and not be in it. So I was interested in moving back to that environment, more of a financial kind of place. But also having that hybrid, I think is really interesting. And we can share a lot of best practice in such a way that, to be honest, advisors, schemes, but also financial services business simply wouldn't, because they would consider it, IP, and they would not want to. But I think we have a role in the industry more generally to be able to share what we do, explain our approach, have other people critique it, discuss it, but also see if that could, over time, become more of a standard or a benchmark for people to aspire to.
Thank you. Anybody with a question from the floor? I've got certainly several more on the app.
There's a problem with the app. It stops people from asking
hiding a light
questions.
behind a bushel. So I'd just be interested in the levy consultation. One of the things you asked about, which I think may be the first time you've asked something similar, is kind of some of the impacts of Brexit and what pension schemes think of that. I was interested in what kind of perspective you're hoping to hear back from schemes. Is it sort of covenant risk and assessing some of those issues, or some of the more kind of technical things?
I think it's more around schemes' concerns, particularly around covenant risk, I would say. We are also interested from the point of view of scheme deficits and scheme sustainability as to what happens if there's significant economic volatility. And we're interested to know whether people have concerns about that. I mean, obviously, we're somewhat reticent to get involved in the wider political debate, but we can be very honest about the fact that obviously there's been a lot of currency volatility as a result of Brexit, and there are longer-term questions about certain assets, and especially assets in the UK. So we really want just to see what people think, I think, at this stage. But there's a wider question about what is the impact of higher economic volatility on schemes? How do they respond to that challenge?
Particular things that you're putting in place now to protect the PPF's investments, for example?
I think the right way for me to put that is, we manage a 30 billion fund, and you would certainly expect us to have the right kind of approach and hedge effectively against significant volatility that could occur. I'm not going to say what it is, but it would be the prudent thing to do.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions from the app. So in a complex and public sector body, how important do you think, and I guess how do you go about kind of internal good governance, given the amount of data that you've got coming in from schemes? Some of it might be market sensitive in some ways as well.
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, data security is a continuing battle. It doesn't stop. It's never finished. I come from an environment where it was, a continuing challenge. But we work carefully with our partners, Experian at present, to make sure that a lot of the data we bring in is properly protected. And we want to make sure that schemes feel that they can give us the information we need to be able to make decisions. And also, to be honest, we hope that it allows them to at least have a predictable, clear, transparent levy, understand where it's come from, understand the decisions that have been taken around it, and can see that easily. And we will make sure that that's a real priority for us.
And perhaps drawing a couple of those themes together, partly the sort of work you did at the DVLA, some of the data you've got here, and some of the kind of wider debate we're having around conference about member engagement and the pensions dashboard. I mean, interested in your insight generally as to how you think that might work, but also whether you think FAS assistance or PPF compensation should be something that you'd hope members might expect to see on a dashboard when it comes into fruition.
I certainly think, given the Minister's commitment on this, certainly for me, that would be logical, and we will certainly look to engage with the process over the coming year or so. It's something we're interested in. One of the problems generally for the industry, which I think is, and I've seen this more widely, is that your ideal situation, to get a little bit technical, is that you have an API going to a fully scalable back office, and it will be easy for you simply to plug straight into the pensions dashboard API and job done. The reality is that our back offices don't really look like that, and there's work to do to get to a point where it's scalable, clear, and also that identity and authentication is safe. So there's the plenty of detail that they talk about. There is plenty of detail.
Work to be done. A question I think that schemes have been grappling with, and one of the things that we're talking about quite a lot at this conference is the latest regs from DWP on investment and ESG, and how schemes are going to have to think about communicating that, and also making sure that they're thinking about financial considerations, including climate change potentially. I'm interested in how you think the PPF is doing with integrating that, and whether you'd be doing more communicating your approach in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we have an ESI approach, and we do talk about it. I think our communication on ESG, our communication, I think, could be better. We need to be clearer about the approach, and I think the really interesting question for me is members' view of the kind of responsible investment that the PPF should be involved in, the things that matter to them as effectively our proxy investors. Mm-hmm. We're keen that we hear more about what they think, and I think that should always be an important component of ESG, is understanding what is driving your members' requirements, not just necessarily what is the fashion at the time.
Okay. We've got one more question, time for one more question from the floor. If anybody's, yes, gentleman here.
I was just wondering, your idea of the digital world, and maybe an app, of how you would encourage people to actually, what are they going to look at? Because, you know, members themselves don't have a huge engagement with their pension scheme until they're, you know, either something goes wrong or they're near retirement. And are you expecting it to be like a live update of from their own pension scheme so they can see how much they're covered for, or just what's happening with the PPF fund?
I think we'd need to test that out. So, you know, my experience on this is that whatever the form will be, whether it's an app or whether it's a web app or whatever, my experience is that, you know, the only real way to do this is to test it. Yes, I would like to encourage people to go in and see what their pension or compensation is doing on more than an annual basis. And if that's true, then it would probably start to justify an app. But if it isn't, then delivering just by the web is absolutely fine. There's a lot more technology that I think I would wish to consider, but at the moment we're not really in a position where we have the choice, given our back office. And I want to at least be in a position where we could expose things in an app if we want to, because we have an API.
I'll ask you a follow-up, Oliver. Just thinking about, you mentioned increasing social media presence and communication as well. Wondering if you're thinking that, you know, instances like the sort of British deal, whether that's an opportunity to very quickly get in touch with members who you'll be protecting, and maybe which might act as a mitigant to some of the other risks that we saw come out of that process.
Yes, definitely. And I think also it allows us to reduce the worry. So, you know, we will give a statement saying, you know, when there are rumours of an insolvency or whatever, we'll put out a statement, generally always saying, you know, you are covered by the PPF. Don't worry. But in the world in which we exist now, the better way to do that would be to generally put that on Twitter, so journalists would pick it up, but also so that anyone who was concerned could see relatively quickly that there's not an issue, here's the scheme, it's absolutely fine. So, yeah, I mean, I do remember the days when people would ask for a business case for having social media accounts for businesses, and it feels like we've moved beyond that now, but I think we can all see a lot of reasons why someone like PPF could actually actively use social media to allay concern and make people feel that PPF was there. We don't have to shout about it, but we can make sure that we're looking after people even before they come to us.
And I think that's a great and a very positive message that we can close the session on. We're out of time, I'm afraid. I think you're round at a conference for today and tomorrow, so if people got questions, please come and grab Oliver. Well, in the nicest possible way. I'd like to say thank you to Oliver in the usual fashion.